In May of 1939, a self-taught excavator named Basil Brown, who had left school at 12 and learned archaeology from library books, pushed his spade into the largest of a cluster of grassy burial mounds on a private estate above a slow tidal river in eastern England. The mounds had been dug into before. The century they belonged to was called the Dark Ages, and every mound he had opened on that estate the previous summer had given up nothing but robbed soil and broken scraps. Brown expected another looted grave. What Brown pushed his spade into instead was one of the richest undisturbed burials ever found in Europe, and a direct refutation of the century that produced it. The mound had not been robbed. Beneath the sand lay the impression of a ship close to 90 feet long, hauled up from the river below, dragged uphill to the ridge, and lowered into a trench cut to receive it. The timber itself was gone. What remained was a stain, dark where the planks had rotted, and rows of iron rivets still holding the shape of a hull that no longer existed. Brown abandoned the spade and worked with a trowel and a hand brush, because the ship was made of nothing but discolored soil, and the weight of a boot would have erased it. In the center of the vessel stood a chamber, and the chamber was intact. Inside it were 37 gold coins, every one struck at a different Frankish mint. A gold buckle weighing close to a pound, its surface worked with interlaced animals so fine that the pattern only resolves under magnification. Shoulder clasps and a purse lid set with thousands of individually cut garnets, most of them carried from South Asia. A great silver dish stamped in Byzantine workshops. Drinking horns, a lyre, a coat of mail, an iron standard, a whetstone carved with human faces, and a helmet in hundreds of corroded fragments. For a century, the period had been described in terms of what it lacked. No cities worth the name, no coinage worth trusting, no craft tradition to speak of, a long unlit gap between the Roman withdrawal and the arrival of anything that deserved the word civilization. The mound contained the opposite of that description. The garnets alone required a supply line running from northern Europe to the Indian Ocean, maintained across a period that was supposed to have had no long-distance trade at all. The construction is the part that is easy to underestimate. A ship of that size does not float uphill. The vessel was rowed or towed to the foot of the ridge, then hauled up a slope of roughly 100 feet by hundreds of people working with ropes and rollers, then eased into a trench dug to fit it, then filled around with sand, then roofed and mounded over. That is weeks of coordinated labor by a population that had to be fed and directed while it worked. The gold in the chamber is evidence of wealth. The hole in the ground is evidence of authority. And then the war. Brown finished the excavation in August of 1939. An inquest was held, and within weeks, the finds were packed away and stored in a disused underground railway tunnel beneath London, while bombs fell over the city. The helmet was not reconstructed properly for another 30 years. No body was ever found in the chamber. Later chemical analysis of the soil suggested that one had lain there and had dissolved completely in the acid sand, leaving a slightly enriched patch of phosphate where a person used to be. The identification remains disputed. The coins point to a burial in the 1620s of the 7th century, which fits a king who died at roughly the right moment in that kingdom, and the argument for him is circumstantial rather than proven. Other candidates have been proposed. What is not disputed is the assemblage, its quality, and its reach. What makes the mound particularly unsettling is not the gold. It is that the poverty was never in the century. The poverty was in the record. A period gets called dark when the people writing about it cannot see, and every generation of historians had been describing an absence of evidence as an absence of achievement. The estate is quiet now. The mounds have been grassed over and fenced. The ship exists as a shape in the sand and a diagram in a book, and the man it was built to carry is a chemical shadow with no name attached to it. Number 2. The remedy in the brass bowl. In 2015, a microbiologist named Freya Harrison, working from a translation of a medical compilation written in England before the Norman conquest, brewed a 1,000-year-old eye remedy out of garlic, onion, wine, and cow bile in a laboratory at an English university. The book it came from sat in a tradition that modern medicine had spent 2 centuries laughing at, a tradition of remedies calling for animal dung and spoken charms, catalogued, translated, and dismissed by every serious history of medicine since the 1800s. Harrison expected the remedy to fail. What the brew produced instead was one of the most awkward results in the modern study of antibiotics, delivered by a recipe older than the oldest cathedral in England. The remedy killed methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Not in a petri dish alone, where many things kill bacteria, including bleach, but in synthetic wounds seeded with mature bacterial films and in infected wounds in living tissue, where the standard drug of last resort struggles. In the most demanding tests, the preparation destroyed close to 90% of the population it was applied to. The comparison figure that mattered was not zero. It was vancomycin. The assumption being corrected here is broader than one book. Early medieval medicine had been filed under superstition, on the reasoning that a culture which attributed illness to elf shot and flying venom could not have been observing anything real. That reasoning conflates a wrong explanation with a wrong observation. A practitioner does not need germ theory to notice that one preparation clears an infected eyelid and another does not, and to write the working one down, and to keep writing it down for as long as it keeps working. The method turned out to be the whole point. Garlic contains a compound that damages bacterial membranes. Bile salts disrupt them differently. Wine is mildly acidic and alcoholic. Copper leaches from a brass vessel. On its own, at the concentrations used, not one of those ingredients did meaningful damage to a mature bacterial film. Combined, prepared in brass, and left to stand for 9 nights before use, the mixture did. The recipe specifies the vessel. It specifies the weight. Modern laboratories reproduce the result only when they stop treating those instructions as decoration and followed them exactly, which is a strange thing to have to learn from a manuscript. Later work extended the finding. The same preparation proved effective against films formed by several other stubborn pathogens, the kinds found in diabetic foot ulcers and chronic wounds, the infections that resist the drugs currently available. The counter-argument is real, and the researchers made it themselves. This is not a cure, and it is not a licensed medicine. The preparation is unstable, difficult to standardize, and its activity varies with the garlic, the wine, and the bile that go into it. The wider claim that ancient books are full of undiscovered drugs is not supported, because most of the recipes in that same manuscript do nothing at all. What one working remedy proves is narrower and sharper than a treasure map. It proves that the filter was wrong. What makes the result particularly disturbing is the arithmetic of the dismissal. The book was catalogued, transcribed, and published. It sat in a national library, readable, for the entire period in which resistant infections became one of the defining medical problems of the modern world. Nobody tested it, because the category the book had been placed in said there was nothing to test. The error was not a lack of access to the evidence. The error was a decision, made long before anyone alive was born, about which kinds of people are capable of knowing something. The manuscript is still on its shelf. The garlic still grows. The infections the remedy was written for are still with us, harder to treat now than they were then, and the practitioners who compiled the recipe left no explanation of how they found it. Number 3. The chamber grave by the garrison. In 1878, a Swedish archaeologist named Hjalmar Stolpe, who had already opened more than 1,000 graves on a single trading island in a cold inland lake, cut down into a chamber grave on the terrace below the garrison wall. The occupant lay with a sword, an axe, a fighting knife, 2 shields, a quiver of armor-piercing arrows, 2 horses, and a full set of gaming pieces with the board, an assemblage that had meant one thing and only one thing in every excavation report written for the previous 100 years. Stolpe recorded the occupant as a man. What Stolpe had opened instead was one of the most contested burials in the archaeology of the period, and it would take 139 years for anyone to say so. The grave was not ordinary, even by the standards of a rich trading town. The weapons were complete rather than symbolic, covering close range, long range, and mounted fighting. The horses were a mare and a stallion, positioned at the foot of the chamber. The gaming set is the detail specialists care about most, because game pieces in graves of that region and period are associated with command rather than combat, with the person who plans an engagement rather than the one who is handed an axe and pointed at a wall. Everything in the chamber said high-status military leadership, and it said so in the strongest terms available in that burial tradition. In the 1970s, an osteologist examining the bones noted that the skeleton looked female. The observation was published. It changed nothing, because a warrior grave containing female bones was read as a bones problem rather than a warrior problem. Perhaps the wrong skeleton had been boxed. Perhaps the measurement was unreliable. The assemblage was doing the identifying, and the assemblage said male, so male it stayed. In 2017, a genomics team sequenced the remains directly. There were 2 X chromosomes and no reads from a Y chromosome anywhere in the sample. Isotope analysis of the teeth indicated a person who had not grown up locally and who had moved during childhood. Careful comparison of the bone catalog numbers against the original field drawings tied the sequenced skeleton to that specific chamber and those specific weapons. The result was not that a woman might be buried there. The result was that the person buried under all of it was genetically female, and that no other individual was present in the chamber. The objections came quickly, and some of them were fair. Excavation standards in the 1870s were poor, and bones from adjacent graves have been mixed before. Grave goods express what a community wanted said about a person, which is not the same as a biography. A sword in a grave is not a signed enlistment record, and there are graves in that culture containing objects nobody thinks the occupant used. The research team addressed the mixing question in a follow-up study and stood by the identification. The debate over what the burial means has not closed, and probably should not. What makes the grave particularly unsettling is not the chromosomes. It is the century of confident cataloging that preceded them. The identification of the occupant as male was never a finding. It was an assumption operating with the authority of a finding, and it survived a direct observation to the contrary because the observation was easier to doubt than the framework. Nobody falsified anything. The system worked exactly as designed, and the design contained the answer before the question was asked. The island is a quiet field now with sheep on it. The chamber was emptied 140-odd years ago, and the objects sit in museum drawers under numbers assigned by a man who believed he knew who he had found. Number 4. The blue in the woman's teeth. In 2014, an archaeological scientist named Christina Warrener, whose laboratory specialized in the hardened plaque that survives on the teeth of the dead, long after everything softer is gone, scraped a fragment of that plaque from the lower jaw of a woman buried in the cemetery of a ruined women's monastery in western Germany. The woman had no name in any record, no grave marker, and no mention in the fragmentary documents that survived the burning of the site, and manuscript history had long held that the books of her century were made by men, since fewer than 1 in 100 surviving manuscripts carries a woman's name. Warrener expected food residue. What she scraped loose instead was ultramarine, one of the most valuable pigments in the medieval world, locked in the teeth of a woman nobody had thought to record. Ultramarine is ground lapis lazuli. In that century, lapis came from one region, a set of mines in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, more than 4,000 miles from the grave. It arrived in Europe as raw stone, and turning stone into usable blue required a laborious process of grinding, kneading with wax and resin, and repeated washing to separate the blue mineral from the gray rock around it. The finished pigment cost as much by weight as gold, and was reserved for the most important passages in the most important books. It was not a color anyone used casually, and it was not a substance that circulated outside a very small number of hands. The particles in the plaque were confirmed by their optical and spectroscopic signature. They were not smeared on the surface. They were embedded in successive layers of calculus, which form slowly and continuously in life, meaning the exposure was repeated over years rather than the result of a single event. The researchers worked through the possible routes. She might have prepared the pigment for someone else, and grinding does throw dust. She might have kissed illuminated pages in devotion, a documented practice. She might have consumed the mineral medicinally, since lapis appears in a few recipes. The distribution and quantity fit best with the simplest explanation available to anyone who has held a fine brush, which is that she pointed the tip with her lips, over and over, for a working life. The reason this matters runs past one woman. The evidence for who made medieval books is almost entirely made of signatures, and signing was rare. discouraged for religious reasons in many houses, and attributed to the institution rather than the individual. Female houses were poorer, were dissolved earlier, and lost their libraries at higher rates. Every filter in the chain of survival ran in the same direction, and the result was a body of evidence that looked like an answer when it was actually a shadow cast by the process that produced it. The counter-argument is that a single individual does not overturn a statistical pattern, and that is correct as far as it goes. One set of teeth is one set of teeth. But the pattern was never built on positive evidence that women did not work in pigment. It was built on the absence of their names, and absence is exactly what this method sidesteps, because plaque does not care whether anyone signed anything. What makes the finding particularly disturbing is how ordinary the woman was. She was middle-aged, buried without distinction, in a house too small to appear in most surveys of the period. If a routine burial in a minor monastery contains one of the most expensive materials on the continent, embedded in her teeth, then the practice was not exceptional. It was normal, and normal is precisely the thing that documents never bother to record. The monastery is a ruin with a footprint marked in grass. The pigment is still blue after 900 years, because ground rock does not fade the way dyes do. Her name is not recoverable by any method now available. Number 5. The silence in the alpine ice. In 2013, a glaciologist named Paul Majewski, who had spent his career pulling climate records out of places where snow has never once melted, drilled a core more than 200 feet long out of a high saddle on the border between Switzerland and Italy, at close to 15,000 feet. The atmosphere before industry was assumed to be effectively clean. The small amounts of lead in old ice were treated as natural background, and the history of the great pandemic that struck Europe in that period rested on parish registers and chronicles, written town by surveyors after the fact. Majewski expected a natural background. What the drill pulled up instead was one of the most detailed continuous records of European industry ever recovered, including 4 years in which that industry stopped completely. Lead gets into high-altitude ice because silver does. The ore that carried silver through the medieval economy carried lead with it, and smelting that ore released lead into the air in quantities that traveled hundreds of miles, settled onto snowfields, and were buried under the following winter. Because the saddle never melts, the layers do not mix. Because the site sits downwind of the mining districts of Britain and Central Europe, it recorded them. Sampled with a laser that vaporizes a track along the length of the core, the ice yields a resolution finer than a year, which means the record can be read against events rather than against centuries. What it shows is an economy with a pulse. Lead climbs through the 12th century as new mines open. It drops during periods of war and unrest and climbs again afterward. It falls when a currency is debased and rises when a crown needs coin. This is not a proxy for the economy in the loose sense that historians usually mean. It is a direct physical measurement of how much metal was being smelted in Europe, taken every year by a glacier without regard to whether anyone was keeping accounts. And then, between 1349 and 1353, it goes to nothing. Not low, not reduced, undetectable. In a record spanning 2,000 years, that value appears once. The mines stopped because the miners were dead or fled, the smelters stopped because the mines stopped, and the sky over Europe cleared to a degree it would not reach again until the 20th century, and only then because of deliberate regulation. The pandemic is normally counted in bodies, through documents that undercount, omit, and were written by the people who lived. Here it appears as a gap in a metal signal, an economy that simply ceases to exhale for 4 years. The objection is that one core is one location, that atmospheric transport is complicated, and that other ice records in other places show a less absolute picture. That is a real limit. What the site provides is not a European average. It is a high-resolution record of a particular airshed, and the airshed happened to cover the mining regions that mattered most. What makes the record particularly unsettling is not what it measures. It is what it implies about everything the documents did not capture. History has been reconstructed from the writings of the literate minority who survived, and every catastrophe has therefore been described by the people it failed to kill. The ice was not a witness with a perspective. It recorded the whole of it, indifferently, and it recorded a silence that no chronicle thought to mention because the people who would have noticed the mines closing were the people dying. The core sits in a freezer now, sliced and catalogued. The saddle is still accumulating snow, and it is still recording, and the layers being laid down this winter will carry a signal from an industrial world that will one day be read the same way. There are 5 more of these, and the last one pins a single year to the first tree a European ever cut down in the Americas, 471 years before the voyage every schoolroom still teaches. Subscribe now and stay for it. Number 6. The diagram drawn 2 centuries early. In 1957, a historian of science named Victor Roberts, working through Arabic astronomical manuscripts in a university library in Beirut, copied out a geometric model of the moon built by a mosque timekeeper who had died in Damascus in the 1370s. The origin story of modern astronomy had been settled for 400 years, taught in every textbook, defended in every survey, and built on the premise that a Polish canon working in the 1500s had devised his mathematics himself, without meaningful debt to anyone outside the Latin tradition. Roberts expected a curiosity. What Roberts copied out instead was one of the most uncomfortable correspondences in the history of science, drawn 2 centuries before the man credited with it was born. The models matched, not resembled, not anticipated in spirit, matched, in the arrangement of circles, in the way each circle was made to compensate for the errors of the last, and in the numerical parameters attached to them. The lunar model published in Europe in 1543 is the lunar model of the Damascus timekeeper, transposed to a sun-centered frame. Once that was noticed, other pieces surfaced quickly, because they had been sitting in the same manuscripts the whole time. The problem being solved was ancient and specific. Inherited astronomy had saved the appearances by allowing a planet to sweep out equal angles around a point that was not the center of its own circle, a device that worked numerically and violated the principle of uniform circular motion that the entire system rested on. Astronomers in the Islamic world spent 3 centuries attacking it, and in a northern observatory in the 1200s, one of them produced the solution. Take a small circle and roll it inside a larger circle of exactly twice the radius. A point on the small circle traces a straight line. That single device converts circular motion into linear oscillation, which lets an astronomer build a model that reproduces the observations without ever breaking the rule. It appears in the Polish canon's first sketch of his system, and again in his major work, in the same application, doing the same job. There is no known Latin translation of the texts that contain it. What exists is a Greek manuscript carrying the device, present in Italy during the years he studied there, and a well-established route by which Byzantine material reached Italian collections after the fall of Constantinople. The transmission is plausible, documented in outline, and unproven in detail. He cited Islamic astronomers by name elsewhere in his work, which establishes that he read them in some form. He did not cite them here. The honest counterargument is that mathematics has a way of arriving independently at the same solution, that the geometry involved is not so vast a space that 2 people could not enter it separately, and that no manuscript with his handwriting in the margin has ever been produced. Some historians hold that position. Others regard the accumulation of identical parameters as beyond coincidence. What almost nobody argues anymore is the version that stood for 4 centuries, in which the models had no ancestry at all. What makes the correspondence particularly disturbing is what it says about how origin stories get built. The astronomy of the Islamic world was not lost, hidden, or destroyed. It was catalogued in European libraries, in languages European scholars could read, waiting for somebody to look. The reason the connection took until the middle of the 20th century to surface is that the people writing the history of science were not reading Arabic manuscripts, and the people reading Arabic manuscripts were not writing the history of science. The mosque still stands and still keeps prayer times. The manuscripts are digitized now, readable from anywhere. The revolution kept the name it was given. And the man in Damascus is a footnote in the story of somebody else's idea. Number 7. The book underneath the prayer book. In 1906, a Danish philologist named Johann Ludwig Heiberg, who had spent 30 years reassembling lost Greek mathematics out of quotations and fragments, leaned over a battered prayer book in a monastery library in Constantinople. The pages under the prayers had been scraped clean, cut in half, rotated, and written across in the 1200s. The volume had been catalogued as an ordinary liturgical manuscript, and it had passed through the hands of librarians and worshippers for 7 centuries without anyone recording an interest in whatever lay beneath the ink. Heiberg expected a prayer book. What Heiberg leaned over instead was one of the most consequential erasures in the history of thought, and the only surviving copy of the work it concealed. Underneath was a treatise in which the greatest mathematician of antiquity explained how he had actually made his discoveries. The formal proofs of the ancient world present results as though they arrived complete, and this text does the opposite. It describes weighing shapes against each other in imagination, slicing solids into infinitely many parallel pieces, and balancing those pieces on a lever to find a volume. It treats infinity as something to be counted with, rather than avoided. The step it does not take is the one that separates it from calculus, and the distance to that step is small enough to be uncomfortable. 2 more works sit in the same volume, including a treatise on floating bodies that had survived only in a later Latin translation, and a fragment on the number of distinct ways a set of shapes can be arranged into a square, which is a problem in combinatorics that nobody expected to see attempted for another 18 centuries. The physical process that saved it is the same process that destroyed it. Parchment was expensive and the supply was limited, so a scribe with a text nobody wanted would scrape the surface with pumice, wash it, cut the sheets to a new size, turn them 90 degrees, and write over them. In this case, the recycled sheets became a book of prayers, completed by a named scribe in the 1220s. The old writing was never fully removed, because iron-based ink bites into the skin. It remained as a ghost, running crosswise under the new lines, faint, broken by the binding, and legible only where the scraping had been careless. Heiberg read what he could with a magnifying glass and daylight and photographed the rest, and his transcription was the only version anyone had for most of the 20th century, because the book then disappeared. It surfaced at auction in 1998, in appalling condition, damaged by mold, with 4 pages carrying forged religious portraits in gold leaf that somebody had painted over the text in the 1920s to raise the price. It sold to an anonymous buyer for more than $2 million and was deposited at a museum for conservation. Imaging with a synchrotron beam then recovered what the magnifying glass could not, because the iron in the ancient ink fluoresces under X-rays and answers straight through the forger's gold. The counter-argument is only about degree. Some pages are gone past recovery, some readings are contested, and the treatise as it survives is incomplete. Nobody disputes what it is. What makes the palimpsest particularly unsettling is the ratio it implies. This is one book, recovered by one man who happened to be looking, from one library, out of an unknown number of volumes that were scraped and reused across 1,000 years of parchment shortage. The scribe who erased it was not a vandal. He was a working man, being economical with an expensive material, and he had no way of knowing what he was holding. Nothing about that situation was rare. The prayer book sits in a climate-controlled case, sliced apart for imaging and never to be rebound. The text has been published. The rest of the library it came from was dispersed, and no catalog exists that would tell anyone what else was written on the underside of the pages. Number 8. The City Under the Forest. In April of 2012, an archaeologist named Damian Evans flew a laser scanner slung beneath a helicopter in overlapping passes across a forested plateau and the flat country below it in northern Cambodia. The temple complex on that plain had been surveyed for more than a century by one of the most thorough colonial mapping efforts ever mounted. Every major monument was drawn and measured, and the ground between the monuments was assumed to be forest and rice, because a century of survey on foot had found nothing else there. Evans expected to fill gaps in an existing map. What the scanner returned instead rewrote the size of one of the largest settlements of the medieval world and put a second city on top of a mountain that no map had ever carried. Laser scanning from the air works because a small fraction of the pulses find their way through gaps in the canopy, strike the ground, and come back. Discard everything that hit a leaf, keep the ground returns, and what remains is a model of the surface, as it would look if the forest were removed. The forest was removed, digitally, from several hundred square miles. Underneath it was a grid, house mounds in ordered rows, ponds dug beside them, one per household, in their thousands. Roads on a strict axial alignment running for miles, canals, embankments, reservoirs, quarries, and field boundaries, all laid out in a pattern that continued far past the edge of every previous map, in every direction, with the temples sitting inside it, rather than standing alone in a clearing. The scale is the part that resists intuition. The settled area covers something on the order of 400 square miles, and population estimates for its peak run into the high hundreds of thousands, which would make it larger than any city in Europe at the same moment by a wide margin. It was not dense in the way a European city was dense. It was a low-rise landscape of houses, gardens, ponds, and rice fields, integrated with an engineered water system, spread across an area comparable to a modern metropolitan region. The reason it stayed invisible is that it was built almost entirely of wood, thatch, and earth, and stone was reserved for the gods. Everything a person lived in has rotted. Only the shapes in the ground remain, and the shapes were under trees. The water is what makes the place legible as a system. Reservoirs of enormous size stored monsoon rainfall, canals distributed it, and the whole network kept a rice economy running through a dry season it could not otherwise have survived. That same network is the leading explanation for what went wrong. Tree ring records from the region show a sequence of severe droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries, broken by intense wet years. Excavation of the canals shows scouring and choking sediment consistent with exactly that pattern. A water system tuned for a stable monsoon is fragile in the face of an unstable one, and infrastructure of that scale is difficult to repair once maintenance is disrupted. The counter-argument is that scanning shows features rather than dates, that not everything visible in the model was occupied simultaneously, and that population estimates from house mounds involve assumptions that reasonable specialists dispute by a factor of 2. All of that is fair. The extent of the built landscape is not in dispute because it is a direct measurement. What makes the discovery particularly disturbing is the word medieval itself. It is a European word for a European period, and it is quietly organized the way the rest of the world is remembered during the same centuries. While the term was being applied to a continent whose largest city held a few 100,000 people at best, an engineered urban region several times that size was operating under a different monsoon on the other side of the world, and the reason it stayed unmapped was not that it was hidden. It was that the survey stopped at the temples. The forest is still there. The plateau is still difficult to reach. The scanning covered a fraction of what could be scanned, and every campaign since has found more. Number 9. The Tombstones by the Lake. In 1885, an Orientalist named Daniel Chwolson, who had built his reputation deciphering Syriac inscriptions that nobody else could handle, read the carved slabs coming out of 2 Christian cemeteries in a river valley below the mountains of what is now northern Kyrgyzstan. The origin of the pandemic that killed a third of Europe had been argued for 5 centuries on the basis of chronicles written far from wherever it started. Every proposed homeland rested on inference rather than evidence, and the debate had produced a long track record of confident answers that later collapsed. Chwolson expected ordinary grave markers. What Chwolson had read instead was one of the most precise pieces of evidence ever recovered about the beginning of the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, and it would sit in print, unused, for 137 years. The stones were dated. That is the first strange thing about them. This was a Christian community using a dating system that converts cleanly to the calendar in use today, and the inscriptions named the year of death, along with the name of the dead. In one small cemetery, the burials spike sharply in 2 years, 1338 and 1339, well above any other period in its use. 10 of those stones state a cause. The word used translates as pestilence. A community of a few hundred people in a valley, on a trading route, buried an abnormal number of its members in a 2-year window and carved the reason into the rock. What that could not establish was which pestilence. Plenty of diseases kill a village, the word is generic, and for well over a century the stones were treated as a suggestive local detail rather than evidence about anything larger. The Great Pandemic reached the Black Sea in 1346 and Europe in 1347, which put the burials in roughly the right decade. But roughly the right decade, in roughly the right region, is not proof of anything, and historians said so. In 2022, the question was closed from a different direction. A team extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of individuals buried under those inscriptions and recovered whole genomes of the plague bacterium. The strain was not merely an early one. It sat at the exact point where the genetic tree of the organism splits into the branches that account for nearly all plague known since, a fork that had been visible in modern genomes for years without anyone being able to place it in time or space. The stones supplied the date. The teeth supplied the identity. The mountains around the valley supplied the reservoir, since the rodent populations there carry closely related strains today. The objections are worth stating plainly. This is one cemetery. Ancient DNA sampling is opportunistic rather than systematic, and a genetic fork could in principle be dated correctly while being located somewhere the sampling has not yet reached. Some historians argue the pandemic spread involved multiple introductions and that a single origin point oversimplifies it. The dating and the identification of the strain are not seriously contested. What makes the sequence particularly unsettling is the gap in the middle. The inscriptions were excavated, translated, and published in the 1880s. The information sat in a scholarly volume, in libraries, in a language specialists could read, through both world wars and the entire modern historiography of the pandemic. The answer was not missing. It was filed under a heading nobody thought to open, waiting for a technique that would not exist for another century. The valley is farmland and orchard now. The stones are in museum storage, and a few remain in the ground. The reservoir in the mountains is still there, still infected, and still occasionally passing the organism to people who handle the animals. Number 10. The year in the tree rings. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad, who had spent years following the geography of medieval sagas along coastlines that professional historians considered fictional, walked ashore at a fishing hamlet on the northern tip of Newfoundland and asked a local man whether there were any old ruins nearby. The story of who reached the Americas first had been fixed for almost 5 centuries, taught as the founding event of the modern world, and every earlier claim of a Norse site on that continent had been examined and found to be a hoax, a misreading, or a natural formation. Ingstad expected another dead end. What Ingstad walked into instead was one of the most decisive corrections ever made to a founding story, and the only confirmed Norse settlement in the Americas. The man pointed him at a set of low, grassy ridges near the shore that everyone locally assumed were old fish stations. They were building foundations. Excavation over the following years uncovered 8 structures of sod, laid over wooden frames, built in a style found in Iceland and Greenland, and nowhere in the indigenous traditions of that coastline, along with a smithy where bog iron had been smelted and worked, iron boat rivets, a bronze cloak pin, a spindle whorl for spinning wool, and the debris of ship repair. The identification was not a matter of interpretation. Ironworking of that kind was not practiced on that coast by anyone else. The settlement was small, perhaps 8 or 9 buildings, capable of holding somewhere under 100 people, and it was not a colony, it was a base, and it was not the western limit. Butternuts turned up in the deposits, along with worked butternut wood. That tree does not grow in Newfoundland, and did not grow there then. The nearest stands lie hundreds of miles southwest, around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which means the people at the site sailed further into the continent than the site itself records, and brought things back. The date remained approximate for 60 years, somewhere around the year 1000, because radiocarbon dating carries an error range of decades, and no amount of care shrinks it much. Then a different method closed it. In the year 993, a burst of cosmic radiation struck the atmosphere and left a sharp spike of a particular carbon isotope in every tree growing anywhere on Earth that year. In wood that still has its bark edge intact, the spike is a fixed mark, and counting the rings outward from it gives a felling date accurate to the year. 3 pieces of wood from the site, from different trees, all cut with metal tools that only the Norse had there, all returned the same answer, 1021. not around. Exactly. The counter-argument is about meaning rather than fact. One base occupied briefly is not a discovery of a continent in the sense that changed world history. The settlement failed within perhaps a decade, and the encounter left no lasting exchange in either direction. All true. It also misses what the date does. What makes the year particularly disturbing is not the 471 years of priority. It is that the information was never lost. The voyages were written down, copied, preserved in Iceland, and read continuously for centuries by scholars who classified them as literature because they contained trolls, and because the people who had described the coastline were not the people whose accounts counted. A local man knew where the ruins were and had known all along. The correction required no new evidence. It required someone to take the existing evidence seriously and go and look. The mounds are a fence site with a boardwalk. The smithy is a depression in the ground. The sagas are still on the shelf where they have always been, and they were telling the truth. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.